Okay, we're going to start. We have a few more people coming in, but we have a lot of information to cover tonight. So I want to make sure that we get through it all because this is a really big topic that affects our young, middle, and high school. Vaping and drug use is a national issue, and we're also seeing it locally. My name is Kim Bradley, and I'm the wellness manager for the school district. So we have wellness centers in our middle school and high schools. We also do programming in our elementary schools. We have therapists, social workers, and we're really looking at all the social emotional learning programming for our school district. So this was sponsored by our wellness program. Today I can speak to some of the things that are going on in the school, but I can't speak to everything at each school site, so I'll do my best with that. But we're really here to bring in some experts on this topic. So we have Letcher, who's with Placer County Office of Education. Unfortunately, because of the storm, she was not able to drive up tonight, but we have her virtually. And she is a vape education instructor for the whole Placer County. She goes into the schools, she does parent talks with Placer County Office of Education. And then we have Shannon Decker, who is the executive director and founder of the Speedy Foundation, which is a nonprofit that is really about advocating and educating around mental health and suicide prevention. She has an extensive background in education, mental health, suicide prevention, and drug and alcohol education. She's currently working with No Overdose Nevada County to educate our community about fentanyl because we are seeing a rise in that as well. I am here today both in my role through the school district, but I'm also a parent. I have 2 high schoolers at Truckee High, and so this also touches me personally because we're seeing just a lot of this in our community. So we're going to start with Caitlin presenting virtually. We're going to talk about vape first, and we can ask some questions, and then we're going to go into fentanyl and drug use after that with Shannon. Thank you so much for being here.
All right. Hi, everyone. I'm Caitlin Letcher. I'm excited to, I was going to say see you all, but hear you all, actually, I guess today. So thanks so much for having me. Can you guys hear me okay? Yeah? Okay. Perfect. So yeah, I'm here to talk to you guys a little bit about e-cigarettes and vaping and kind of what we call like the youth epidemic at the moment, just because we've seen over the last few years, vaping just go on such a high rise with our youth, starting for some of our youth in as young as middle school, but really flowing through into high school. So our team at Placer County is a tobacco use prevention education program. We historically have just been doing kind of some smaller outreach and technical assistance to our county itself. But we actually just got awarded a bigger grant that will actually be able to start providing many more services to Placer County and hopefully even more up in the Tahoe-Truckee area to you all. So we're really excited about that and seeing kind of how that's going to come over the next few years. So hopefully even more parent talks and more time in the classroom with students. So my other coworkers, Nancy Soto Ramirez and Amanda Cosington, weren't able to jump on today, but they're lovely and going to be providing the same type of information to our schools that I'll be today. So let me see here. There we go. So I like to start out with giving everyone just kind of the same basic knowledge about e-cigarettes and vape devices. Also, e-cigarettes is kind of the scientific term that we use, but vaping and vapes is really what we're hearing. So you're going to kind of hear me use both and they mean the same thing. But also, a lot of the slides that I'm showing you all today are the same slides or similar slides to what I show youth. So I like to give you guys what your students or your youth are seeing so that if you do go home and they've had a presentation, you've seen a presentation, you guys can have a conversation about the information you're seeing. So some of you may know a little bit about e-cigarettes and vape devices, some may not. But so when we're looking at vape devices, they all look a bit different, but they all have the same basic components. So this is a vape device here, and within it, they all have a lithium battery, like what's in our portable chargers. Most of them are rechargeable. And then they have this little atomizer or coil. It's this little white kind of spoolie here. What that is that's a piece of metal within the device itself that heats up to a few hundred degrees when the device is engaged. And that comes into play when this absorbent material that sits before that coil in here, that kind of is when you think about like a cotton pad or a cotton ball, when we get it saturated with something, it doesn't really change size, but it gets fully saturated. So what that is in this device is that's all of the vape liquid, the juice, the different chemicals, and the nicotine and flavorants that are within this product. And so what happens when we engage in the device itself, you see as we kind of pull on the device, the liquid material hits that atomizer or coil and it starts heating up to a few hundred degrees. And that's when we start to see those big clouds, right? So what's actually produced from a vape device, which I'll kind of touch on a little bit later, is actually an aerosol. It's not a vapor at all. And I'll go into what that is on a slide in just a few, but wanted to get your mind kind of wrapped around the idea that although we say vape in vape devices, it's not vapor because vapor is water-based, right? And there's actually thousands of chemicals within these devices itself that change properties when they heat up into this aerosol or the clouds that we see. And so when we're looking out and looking at different vape devices, there's a few kind of basic main ones that we have here. So on the left side, you're going to see those little squares or those rectangles. That's a pod. So that's a pod-based system. There is the coil as well as the e-juice or vape liquid housed within the same device that clicks in and out of a vape device. So if anyone's familiar with Juul, that's kind of the biggest one that popped out on the market a few years ago. And so it kind of looks like a USB. That piece is only the size of like the tip of my thumb. So it's about a 1 inch by 1 inch area. And it actually holds all of that vape liquid that we're getting when we use the device in there. And then on the right side, we have these eyedropper looking bottles. And that's what houses like e-juice and vape juice that goes into a bigger device called a tanker mod, which I'm going to show you in a second. But those ones can actually be manipulated and put into a device itself rather than being transported just in a prepackaged piece. So when we talk about e-cigarettes, and I'll jump into kind of what they look like in a second, but I think it's really important to give a little bit of history. So e-cigarettes and vapes were invented back in 2003 with the intent to be a cessation or a quitting device. So originally was created for people who are smoking cigarettes to use it to wean off and eventually be able to quit. And the problem is we're seeing either people who were smoking cigarettes and getting onto vape devices, it not actually helping as well as we had intended. And also we're seeing so many people as first-time users with these nicotine products starting with vaping. That's mainly happening with our youth right now. We were seeing such a downturn in cigarette sales that actually the generation, what are they, Gen Z now, was supposed to be the last generation to like have access to cigarettes because it was dropping so heavily. However, the tobacco industry really latched on to this vape device and started finding ways to ensure that they can make money over time and hook new users. And so when we're looking at what e-cigarettes and vapes look like, unfortunately, if I were to show you like everyone that's out there, this would be like a 3-hour presentation with like 100 slides because there's new ones every day. But I like to give you kind of a rough idea of what you might see or some things that will resemble vape devices that you might see out there. So when I was mentioning those eyedropper bottles, the ones that you can put the e-juice or the vape liquid into the device itself, I'm talking about these large size tank devices. You see that they're big and they're handheld. They fit inside the palm of your hand. We don't often see many youth using these because they are harder to access. They're more expensive and they're meant for heavier users typically because you can actually alter and customize the juice and liquid that you're putting in. However, we do see some youth using them and typically getting these products from friends or siblings or parents, unfortunately, or they're able to purchase some of these products online from typically out-of-state sites, like outside of California, because California is really cracking down. And I'll get into policy in just a little bit. But those aren't the ones that we're mainly seeing. We're mainly seeing these rechargeable e-cigarette styles, or kind of what you're seeing on the top half, like these slender cigarette size, or these kind of big rectangles that look like USB drives. So that's typically what we're getting because those are rechargeable devices where you can buy pods, or there's some that are disposable to where you buy the product itself, and as soon as you finish, the liquid inside it is disposable. So we're mainly seeing that because it's a little bit easier to conceal. The rechargeable ones you can take apart, so a friend can have a piece, another friend can have another. So making it a little bit more accessible, and that's typically what they're rolling towards right now. However, that isn't to say that we aren't seeing these larger devices around. And I keep all the way on the right here, the disposable e-cigarette that actually looks like a cigarette. That's what they looked like when they first came out. So I show this slide to youth just to kind of remind them, and I try to start that cognitive dissonance early of, if these products were meant for you and your age group, right, why would we have to have things that are easily concealed? So I just like to kind of get their brain thinking about the tobacco industry in itself, because I think that that's a big piece for our youth right now, is the desire to not be manipulated, and also just understanding that there's a large corporation and corporations involved in actually getting them hooked on these devices. And so I like to show you guys these. I do not show youth these because I don't want to give any ideas, but these are some of the stealthy kind of vapes that are out there on the market. I do want to say that we are not seeing very many youth with these products, but we do see them at times. So for example, on the far right upper side, you see, iPhone case, and it's actually a vape device. There are watches that are vape devices or key fobs. And for a while, there were these sweatshirts on the market that actually were vape devices as well. So this to me really screams that these companies are targeting folks who it's not legal to own this, because my big thing is, if it's legal, why do we need to hide it, right? So like I said, we're not seeing all of our youth with these, but just keeping in mind to see if they have maybe like a new technology device or something like that that seems a little different that you didn't purchase or you don't know where it came from. Just keeping an extra eye on all these different products, because these companies are very clever and our youth are really smart and really clever. When we think about it, we were all teenagers once, and we were probably doing certain things that we weren't supposed to. So sometimes if we put our brains into that, we can understand a little bit better of like where maybe some of these products are hiding or what they might look like, or where to kind of keep our eye out. So when we're thinking of breaking down what to watch for and we're looking for warning signs, unfortunately, there's not like an end all be all key indicator, right? When I'm talking to parents as well as staff, because I do staff presentations as well, it's just a reminder of, it's a lot of things compounding. So a big one definitely is these products have really like fun flavors, different scents, mango, all these different things. I'm going to talk a little bit later about how a flavor ban in California has been put into effect, which is great. However, some of these products are able to be purchased online out of state. So all of these scents and flavors aren't necessarily going to go away with the flavor ban, but it might get a little more difficult to tell. However, when you're thinking about it, people go to Bath and Body Works or they have perfumes. So when I'm saying fun, interesting scents, it's not necessarily the only indicator. But when we look at it compounded on top of what these devices look like unfamiliar USB drives, different battery chargers, spare parts, a lot of youth are kind of breaking it down and keeping it in different pieces, so it's not as obvious that it's a device. So just keeping an eye out on new devices that you're seeing in your home and just doing a double check. Unfortunately, we have folks who in the classroom it happens, and totally understandable, but handing back what they think is a USB drive, but it's actually a vape device. So just being a little bit more aware of the devices in your home. Also, we are starting to see certain lung illnesses like pneumonia or different lung issues or exacerbation of our asthma, folks with asthma, with these different products. Unfortunately, because they've really only been popularized over the last 6 or so years, we do not have much long-term data or research. We are starting to get some of the short-term research of seeing the issues with lung illnesses and injuries coming out. But like I mentioned, before, is looking at it with all these other warning signs. The last one here to look out for, which can be a tough one to look out for with our youth, is irritability, restlessness, sleeplessness, things having to do with mood. Because with these vape devices, a lot of our youth are thinking that they're going to alleviate anxiety or stress. And it might do that for the first tiny bit that they're using, but it actually is starting to rewire the brain in the different areas of learning, attention, memory, and mood. Okay. So what happens is the nicotine, which I'm going to talk about a little bit later, but it starts to kind of rewire brains. So we're starting to see mood shift and mood irritability a lot in our youth. Keep in mind, they are teenagers. So this is totally a natural part of life. But like I said before, just looking at all of these pieces together is really important to see if there's a warning sign. Also, you know your youth well. So just starting to have these conversations early and showing them that there is a space to have this conversation is really important. Because I'm going to talk a little bit in a moment about why youth are using, but it is a reminder that these companies are targeting our youth. So we do need to be having these conversations also in a space of they're being targeted a little bit as well. So just kind of keeping an eye on that. Now, I mentioned earlier when we're talking about the device itself, an aerosol versus a water vapor. So what vapes are not is water vapor. A vapor is a visible exhalation such as steam or fog. So it disappears completely when cooled. So when you think about it, when you're like boiling a pot of pasta or noodles or something, we have steam in the air, that's vapor. As soon as it cools down, it just mixes back in the air, totally fine. Now, an aerosol, which is what these vape devices produce, is actually a mixture of liquid particles suspended inside of a gas. So instead of just mixing with the air like a pure gas, aerosols actually leave little droplets behind. So an example that I give our students is, we all know what Febreze is, right? So when we spray Febreze, you can see it for a second, but you can still smell it after it goes away. And that's because we want that in that context to still be around. But that's what an aerosol is although we cannot see it anymore, it's still living in the air because it does not reabsorb, right? So with that being said, as soon as things start cooling down, it starts leaving these droplets behind. So as soon as the aerosol exits the device, it starts leaving those droplets behind as we go through our throat and into our lungs. Even though when we or they breathe it out, we're seeing this huge cloud of aerosol, it's still leaving behind things in our lungs, especially because our lungs are so fragile. And so it's starting to pick up and hold on to these different chemicals. And then what a lot of people don't recognize is, we know with cigarettes, there's secondhand smoke, and that's just as dangerous and unhealthy. With vape devices, because it's an aerosol, there is secondhand smoke as well. So if you're around someone who's vaping, or you are vaping around someone else and they're breathing that in, they're getting the same chemicals that you're ingesting as well as the surfaces in your home if you're vaping inside, because that's a big change. Is cigarettes, not as many people were smoking cigarettes indoors as people are vaping indoors, because the perceived harm is different because of the smelling good and because of the way it's advertised. So when we think about aerosol and it's leaving particles on our couches, on our surfaces in our home, animals who are touching that, kids who are touching that, are getting that chemical secondhand. So that's just something to keep in mind if we ourselves are vaping, or if we're seeing our youth vaping, just reminding them that like this is a secondhand smoke issue around us all also. So I want to talk just a little bit. I really jump into more of the chemicals with our youth, but for the sake of time and what I think is the most important and what I mainly hammer home with our youth is nicotine. So nicotine is also in these vape devices, including the bottles of vape juice that say 0 milligrams. We are still finding nicotine levels within those when they're being tested. So you might have someone say, oh, it says 0 milligrams of nicotine. We don't actually know that, because unfortunately, vape devices are not FDA regulated. So that's the Food and Drug Administration, right? They're the ones who, if something's regulated, they have to tell us every single chemical ingredient that's in that product. Right now, most vape devices are not FDA regulated because they have been in lawsuits back and forth for years. So they're only sharing with us the information and the chemicals that are in these products that they want to share. Our friends down at Stanford, the university, they have a big research team that actually like leads the way on most of this tobacco and nicotine research. And they're the ones who are doing a lot of that and finding out that there's more chemicals than we're being told, and finding that a lot of these companies are kind of fibbing a little bit. So I just wanted to make that note, is just because it says 0 doesn't necessarily mean that there's no nicotine in some of these products. But nicotine itself, like I mentioned earlier, targets the part of the brain which controls attention, learning, memory, and mood. And nicotine and other chemicals within the device actually change the way that synapses, or the different connection points within our brains, are formed. So it harms and slows development within the brain. And unfortunately, our brains aren't fully developed until 25. So especially with our youth, middle school through high school, just as bad, it's really starting to attack these different areas. So that's why I mentioned earlier, we're seeing different things with mood. We're seeing attention, learning, and memory also being hardly affected, because nicotine looks so similar to a lot of the chemicals that we create on our own. Also, when we're looking at these devices, for example, the easiest one to share with you is Juul Pod, because they were the biggest ones on the market to start. And when they first came out, they said that there was about 20 milligrams of nicotine in each pod. And within a pack of cigarettes, there's only 20 milligrams of nicotine as well, because each cigarette is only 1 milligram. So people said, okay, that's great. One pod is about 1 pack. And then actually Stanford did a bunch of research, found out that there's actually about 41 milligrams of nicotine in every Juul pod. And so that's 2 packs of cigarettes per Juul pod. If we're kind of thinking in that type of context, I think it's a little easier to wrap our head around, because we know a lot about cigarettes. And also, so many of our youth are very, very surprised at this fact, because they don't realize how much nicotine are actually in this product. So just keeping an eye out, if you do know someone who's struggling with using, or you have a youth and they're going through like a pod a day, that's 2 packs of cigarettes. Now, I do want to say we're not seeing all of our youth go through nicotine and these pods that quickly. However, we do see some, unfortunately, because the addiction is really real. If you've known anyone who's ever tried to quit smoking cigarettes or nicotine, it is actually one of the hardest substances to quit. So just kind of putting it into perspective, how much nicotine are actually in these devices. So when we're looking at nicotine itself and what kind of happens when we're using this is a slide I show youth because I do think it's really important for us to be realistic and honest with them. Because let's be real, I was a teenager once. You can see through the scare tactics. So I like to give them all the information so that they actually understand what these products are doing. So nicotine does initially provide a buzz and relaxing feelings, because that's what nicotine is designed to do. And that's because what it does is stimulate the release of an excess of dopamine. Dopamine is a chemical that we already produce within our own heads, okay? And so with that, it's a really great chemical because we need it to survive. It's the feel-good chemical. It has a drive for reward. I give an example of if anybody else is a foodie like me, when you know you're about to have like your favorite meal, you can get really excited, or you think about it all day. Or if you love coffee, right? There's something there. It's because you're going to produce dopamine when you're enjoying something, and we produce a natural amount. However, nicotine stimulates an excess amount, 3 to 4 times than what we can actually produce on our own. So what happens is that we start very quickly to create a tolerance as well as a dependence on nicotine, because our brain needs dopamine. But what happens is that this tolerance that's created means that we need more and more dopamine every single time. So more and more nicotine every single time to feel just a base level. I tell my youth, not even happy, just base level normal, right? So what happens over time is that we create a dependence or an addiction hardcore to nicotine because of this dopamine excess, as well as nicotine is just an addictive chemical in general. But this is what the brain is seeing and hearing. The cool in good context, but scary in this context thing about dopamine is it's associated with memory. So it does remember your brain remembers what you were doing when you got this rush of dopamine. So it knows you were vaping, or at least that oral fixation, right? So a lot of people, when they're quitting or going through cessation processes, smoking and vaping also is this oral fixation because that's a piece of the addiction. So just keeping in mind that although our youth are making a choice to use at first, one, most of them don't actually understand what these products are. A lot of this information is the first time they've ever heard this. And two, it is a real addiction. So our youth are struggling. And unfortunately, we're seeing a lot of youth now struggling with cessation and wanting to quit and luckily using our services to help them quit. However, that's kind of what we're on right now with a lot of our students. A lot of them I talk to say they wish they could quit, but they have a really hard time. So it's just giving them a lot of this information prior to where when they are, given the opportunity for a decision or to make a choice, they know what it does. But also it's kind of showing some of our youth who are already using what's actually happening in their brain. So we're talking a little bit about everything that vapes do, the different addiction piece, but I do think it's really important for us to zone back into why our youth are vaping, right? So right now, they are adolescent development. There's a lot of things that are happening that are totally natural and normal right now with our youth. So for example, they're in kind of a risk-taking stage of life. They're trying to make new decisions for themselves. They're individuating. So that means that they're trying to figure out what their style is, what they're into. So they're hit with this time of making choices for themselves and maybe making risky kind of decisions is absolutely normal. But that's why we want to talk to them about this, about healthy risks and healthy individuating. But like I said, this is kind of a moment in their lives that they are making these choices. Also, different stress and expectations. When I talk with youth, we always have a moment in all of the presentations where I give them time to talk to me about why they think they're vaping, why they are vaping, and all the different things that they might be feeling anxiety or stress about. And the biggest answer I get every single time about why youth are vaping is because they're stressed, is because there's a lot going on in their lives. And so I do think that sometimes we can forget the extremity of the extreme of how stressed they actually are or what they're going through. And it's not just one type of youth who are vaping. We're seeing it across the board, right? Like even back in even my time, you wouldn't see necessarily your straight A students smoking cigarettes or smoking weed, but we're seeing our straight A students vaping and things like that because it's a really accessible way in their brains to alleviate stress. And so we're seeing them being stressed out about academics, school, extracurriculars like their sports, maybe band, all these different things. Also, family and home life is big, and peer pressures, right? So just kind of keeping in mind that there's a lot going on for our youth right now. And in ways it is understandable that they are looking for an outlet to help them with this stress. Also, social media pressures. I don't know how many of you are as thankful as I am. I'm so happy I did not grow up with Instagram or TikTok. I couldn't do it. So when we think about it, there's also all of this pressure and this visibility that youth are getting, this different messaging about their favorite celebrities who vape, all these different things. So just keeping in mind that there are reasons that our youth are using substances other than they're just being rebellious and just want to make a choice. There's a lot of different things that go into this. Also, this is kind of the type of things that they're seeing in media. We're seeing a little bit less in media now because there's been more regulations. However, this is the type of media that's being pushed out. So it's young people having a good time. It's really promoted as a social thing. We also know that our youth use it really socially and with friends and share devices, right? And so let me just move ahead. This is one I do show youth too. Here's a few vape brands. Some are older, some are newer, right? And they're actually all owned by big tobacco companies, so cigarette companies. And this one I think is just really important, especially to show our youth, is because we all inherently remember and know that cigarettes aren't good for us. We know what's wrong. We know they're bad. But they own all these companies that are trying to show that they're better. So this kind of creates a little bit of that cognitive dissonance for our youth to actually see the marketing and see the manipulation that these companies are trying to hold over them. So want to give you guys a little bit of information about what's being done federally as well as locally. This is kind of what's happening on the federal level. Not many updates at the moment because that's difficult to do across the states. Originally, though, they were not categorized as a tobacco product because the tobacco piece, it isn't really there. It's the nicotine piece. And so originally, when this started getting big, it was a very big barrier to prevention and regulation. However, now they are actually categorized as a tobacco product, but it's because of the nicotine, which is a really big win for us in prevention. What I mentioned earlier about the FDA and big tobacco is like through 2018 and 26 from 2018 2016, a bunch of back and forth lawsuits. Things were supposed to be regulated in 2016. Most are still not regulated because they have a lot of money to go back and forth with the FDA. So then when we're looking at state policy, what's great is the California age to purchase any tobacco product a few years ago went up to 21, so making it a lot less accessible for our youth. Here are some of our passed and approved bills within the state. So SB 8 went into effect a few years ago. So it's a smoking ban that includes vape products or e-cigarette products within state parks, coastal beaches, and local areas. SB 39 is stricter requirements for online e-cigarette and vaping sales. So currently sellers must verify age within California in order to purchase a tobacco product, and it requires a signature of 21 or older. That's great within California, but I will say that since the flavor ban, which I'm about to share with you, went into effect, things are getting much more accessible ordering online outside of California, which some other states do not have the same requirements of requiring a signature or verifying age. Some of the online websites, unfortunately, you just have to put in a birth date or just take a photo of an ID. So just keeping a reminder out of another thing to look for is like new and a bunch of packages coming, because what we're seeing the access right now for youth is that one student is able to get access or buy online, and then they're selling. So just keeping an eye out at home too about like the different products or the different packages. I know that's difficult because of the world of Amazon we live in, but just maybe keeping an eye on that. Also, the really big one that just went into effect at the beginning of this year is a statewide floor ban prohibiting certain flavored tobacco product sales by anyone selling tobacco products from a retail location. So it covers a whole range of flavored tobacco products, which include menthol cigarettes, chewing tobacco, snuff, cigars, e-cigarettes, roll your own tobacco, and I think we said that. Yeah, the cigars. So that's really great. It covers this flavor ban. It goes into e-cigarettes in the sense of the pod systems, as well as the vape liquid and juice. So what people are having to do now, if they want things that are other than tobacco flavored, they have to buy out of state and get it delivered. So I do think that we are seeing that helping us in our prevention efforts and intervention efforts, because it's much more difficult for youth to be getting these products, but just keeping an eye out that it's not a complete solution because it's not federally banned yet either. There's some local policy I'll just go through super quickly around you all. I think, Tahoe-Truckee areas are still working on some different bans and some different requirements, regulations. But the city of Auburn is working right now to have tobacco retail license and smoke-free parks, retail density zones, so new retailers can't come in within 1,000 feet of a park or 500 feet from another retailer, flavored tobacco bans in the area, and purchase using. Then also we see City of Rockland has tobacco retail density, smoke-free parks. Loomis has smoke-free parks and flavor bans, and so does Roseville and Colfax. Now with the statewide flavor ban that encompasses all of these areas for sure. So we're hopefully going to see more regulations and bans roll out that are going to protect our youth. But the difficulty is that we have adults who use these products, so we can't necessarily ban outright, right? So it's just keeping an eye on your local legislature and getting out there and voting for what you believe in with our youth and what can you do, right? So kind of to wrap us up, not all of our kids are vaping. I don't want this to be, a big panic, but it is an issue, and it is a big enough issue for us to have conversations with our students and come to schools and have these conversations as well. So just a reminder, not everyone's doing it, but it is out there and it is happening. Another big one is educating, right? So that's why we come to the schools. That's why we come to educate you all, so you feel equipped to have these conversations, doing it early and often. We start our prevention education presentations as young as 6th grade, because when we talk to high schoolers, a lot of them are saying that they started in 7th and 8th grade. So we want to try to really focus on our 6th graders and up, just to try to kind of get all of this information and education to them early. Also, the balance piece, I think, is huge. Like I was mentioning earlier, our youth are victims of the tobacco industry. Yes, they are making decisions for themselves, but there's a lot of manipulation happening and peer pressure. So just reminding us that this issue is not like an us versus our students, it's us against the big tobacco retailers, and trying to create spaces for our youth to be able to have these conversations. Also, like I said, there's stress. There's a reason why students are using these. When we're working one-on-one with our youth, it is often always because they were looking for something to help alleviate, or something was going on in their lives and it was just easy. And just a reminder that nicotine is a very, very, very hard thing to quit. So if we are working with youth in cessation, just patience and giving them the support they need and helping them with the next steps and these different coping skills and mechanisms. So when we work with our youth one-on-one, it's a lot about the harm reduction, right? And working with them on different coping skills and mechanisms and giving them a space to have a conversation. So I think that's really important when we kind of take this back to our youth. So like I said, we have different protective factors. So engaging in school, having caring adults. You all have incredible educators in your area who care about these students and want to support and help them. Also, effective interventions, the relational style. So find out why they're using, so then we can actually address the problem. We provide, right now, there's only 2 of us who are able to provide this in all of Placer County, but we're hoping with this new grant to be able to hire more folks and provide this out where. But this is a thing called brief intervention. That's our one-on-one meetings with youth to help them either just when they first are using and getting caught, or also with some cessation efforts as well. And the last one, using your voice for what you believe in. A lot of these things can only be handled at local and state levels. So just kind of paying attention to what's out there and how we can support our youth with these different products. Then there are some quitting resources out there. Not as many youth specific focus, but they're starting to roll out. But there's different apps for Apple, Android, there's texting, and then there's online things. So if anyone's interested, I have all of that. It's just kind of a lot to take in now. But there are some quitting resources out there as well. Yeah, so just wanted to kind of wrap up to see if there's any questions or comments on what you might be seeing or hearing out there. I don't have a youth in my life, so sometimes you guys are the subject matter experts for me. But thank you so much for your time. If you have any questions, I'm all ears.
Caitlin?
Yeah.
I think for the sake of time, we're going to roll into Shannon's talk.
Great.
Hi, everyone. I'm Shannon Decker. I run the Speedy Foundation. I'm excited to be here tonight. So I am here to share with you the opioid overdose prevention information. And there is a lot to cover. So this is going to be a very high-level overview. I want to make sure that I get to any of the concerns that you're walking in the door with tonight. So to cover that, I would love if you could raise your hand if you are the parent or guardian of a child in this community. Okay. All right, awesome. And does your child have access to a smartphone or social media? Yes, no, okay, awesome. Most do. Nothing wrong with that. What are some of your concerns? Does anyone have anything they want me to make sure that we cover? JD.
Social media and how dealers are getting to the children to market drugs to them via social media.
Okay. So just to repeat that for anybody that needs it from the audience, social media, how are drug dealers marketing to youth? Great. I don't have a slide for that, But Kim, I emailed you a link, so at the end, we can open the link that's in your email, and I'll show something that's very specific. Anything else that you guys, high level, really want to cover? Yeah. Okay. Yes. The formats that opioids are coming in. Great. I can definitely go through that. Anything else major? We can ask questions at the end. I just want to make sure that I don't glide over something that's really important to this audience. Okay. Yeah. Access to testing. We can absolutely cover that. All right. Great. Let's jump in. So I'm Shannon Decker. I have a master's in educational leadership. I've spent years in the classroom, in special ed, in alternative ed, in private and public settings all across Idaho, Nevada, and California. I am working on the Chief of Police's Advisory Committee. I'm a member of the Truckee Tahoe Suicide Prevention Coalition, and also contracting with Nevada County to roll out the No Overdose campaign. Today what we're going to be talking about is the background of the opioid crisis and what causes opioid overdoses. We're going to learn to identify some of the signs and symptoms of opioid overdoses. We're going to talk about Narcan, which reverses an opioid overdose, as well as the basics of fentanyl testing strips. We are going to learn about the opioid overdose prevention resources in this community, and there are a lot out there on the table, but we'll go in depth and really look at this No Overdose campaign. So, some of the terms that we're going to be talking about are opioids or opiates. This is a class of drug that interacts with the opioid receptors on the nerve endings in our body and our brain. We're going to be talking about fentanyl. Fentanyl has a high potency. It's a type of opioid. It's used medically as well as recreationally. It's used medically pretty responsibly. However, it has been so easy to manufacture as a synthetic opioid that it has entered into our recreational drug supply in ways that we were not prepared for, and we're just now starting to become aware of the impacts. Narcan, or naloxone, this is the drug that reverses an opioid overdose. Naloxone is the general drug. Narcan is the brand of the nasal spray that we have available very prevalently in our community. The Good Samaritan Law is a law that protects people from getting in trouble if they report an overdose to law enforcement. It protects us if we are engaging in first response with someone who might be overdosing. And this is something that we really need to share, especially with our youth, to empower them that if there is someone who's potentially overdosing, we don't want them to be afraid of any type of retribution from law enforcement. We need them to understand that there are going to be no legal consequences for getting their friend medical attention. There will be consequences if they do not get their friend medical attention. And then we'll be talking about other drugs, non-opioids, that could be interacting or with opioids, and they could be contaminated with something like fentanyl. So an opioid has we have a lot of different types of opioids. Hydrocodone, oxycodone, morphine, these are all opioids that maybe you're aware of from just medical life. It's a painkiller that maybe you've been prescribed. So there's opioids are a class of drugs. There's illicit drugs like heroin. There are synthetic opioids like fentanyl. And there are legal drugs that are prescription-based like Oxycontin. Heroin, funny enough, used to be a prescription drug. It was made by the Bayer Corporation, and it was supposed to help people that were addicted to morphine. However, it's more potent than morphine and really created all kinds of problems for us. All opioids are chemically related, and they interact with those opioid receptors and the nerves in our body. These receptors, they are the ones that produce perceptions of pain. They also increase our perceptions of pleasure. The term euphoria is something that somebody who's on opioids might state. At a very low dose, an opioid makes a person sleepy or slow, but at a high dose, their breathing and their heart rate start to decrease. During an opioid overdose, the main concern is really that lack of oxygen getting to the brain. Opioids have been used for thousands of years, medically, recreationally, and spiritually. But most recently, they've been used medically in our society for pain management. Looking at the history, I know that these are little teeny tinies, but our first opioid epidemic in the United States isn't right now. It happened way back when. In 1803, a German chemist isolated morphine from the opium poppy, and that's kind of where things kicked off. By the mid-1800s was when the US had our first addiction crisis. The Civil War soldiers were in a lot of pain, and they were being overexposed to morphine. This is when prescriptions really started to increase. As the 1800s continued, those overdoses were growing at a really high level. That's when the Bayer Corporation introduced heroin to promote a safer, low-risk alternative to morphine, which we know was not the case. New York City, white populations in urban areas began to purchase those pharmaceutical-grade opioid tablets, and then they used them in a non-medical sense. They were creating this new type of addiction. In 1914, the US government stepped in. They created laws to help regulate opioids, and the overdose and the rates of addiction began to decrease due to that oversight and regulation. After World War II, there was a new epidemic that started to occur. It was an emergence of the black market, so illicitly manufactured heroin. And this started to really impact mainly the inner city non-white population. And this is the opioid crisis that we saw going into the 70s. In 1995, this is when today's epidemic really started. Pain was introduced as the fifth vital sign within our healthcare system at exactly the same time that OxyContin was introduced by Purdue Pharma. They also created a campaign that encouraged the healthcare system to write prescriptions more commonly for conditions that weren't necessarily prescribed opioids in the past. So the prescriptions rapidly increased, and then our rates of opioid addiction and overdose deaths increased. In 2017, the US government announced a 5-point plan to combat the opioid crisis. In 2020, fentanyl overdose-related deaths really escalated in our country as the COVID-19 pandemic took hold. In 2022, Purdue Pharma and the US states agreed to an opioid settlement. And in 2023, here locally, we've launched the No Overdose campaign. Okay, so fentanyl, what is this? This is a synthetic opioid that's 50 to 100 times as potent as morphine. So if you've ever had morphine prescribed to you, or if you know someone who has, you know what that feeling might be, you know, the pain relief that you get from it. So fentanyl is going to be 100 times more potent. It is used medically. It'll be prescribed by the healthcare system for pain management, especially after surgeries and for cancer treatment. And so if you know someone who has experienced a major surgery, they may have been treated with fentanyl. However, some people intentionally use fentanyl recreationally because of its potency. So if someone were using an opioid and that opioid became too expensive or their tolerance got too high, they might switch from something like heroin to fentanyl on purpose because fentanyl is so much stronger, you need so much less. Most people who use fentanyl are unaware of its presence. So the majority of what we're talking about here tonight is that unknown, contaminated, or counterfeit drug that has fentanyl in it, because it is being mixed into street drugs as counterfeit pills. And so what that looks like is any other type of pill. It looks exactly, this is an authentic oxycodone, and the fake one looks even better. You can find counterfeit pills of any variety, and it's very difficult to tell a counterfeit pill from a prescribed pill at the pharmacy. If you are not getting your pharmaceuticals directly from the pharmacy, there's no guarantee that they do not have fentanyl in them, that they are not contaminated. When we think about fentanyl, we have an analogy of a chocolate chip cookie, and you guys might have gotten some chocolate chip cookies out there. The analogy is that a chocolate chip cookie has chunks of chocolate in some parts, but not others. The same is true with fentanyl. It's not always evenly distributed throughout the supply. If you think about who is making these pills, there's no incentive for them to do them well the way a pharmacist does. They are doing this fast and cheap, and it doesn't matter if the fentanyl is even throughout the entire pill. It can also be denser as a powder, so the fentanyl will sink to the bottom, so it could only be on one side of a pill. If young people were to get a counterfeit pill and split it, one person might get a lot of fentanyl in it, whereas the other person didn't. This is an image of fentanyl that was confiscated here in Truckee in November. The police were conducting an investigation into some illicit narcotics, and it resulted in over 1.5 ounces of this colored fentanyl being taken off the streets, and the suspect being charged with possession of narcotics with the intent to sell. So again, when fentanyl is used in a medical setting and it's controlled and regulated, it does its job. But this synthetic opioid is really, really easy to manufacture and to obtain over the dark market. The United States Drug Enforcement Administration estimates merely 2 milligrams of fentanyl has the ability to have a lethal dose on the average person. The amount of fentanyl seized by the officers would have the potential killing of approximately 21,262 people from that picture. So Truckee Police, Nevada County Sheriff, Placer County Sheriff, they're all working hard to keep this off the streets and out of our drug supply. Part of the concern is that fentanyl could be absorbed through the skin. This is something that young people have a misunderstanding about, and we don't have time, unfortunately, tonight to watch this video, but there's a 3-minute video from UC Davis that's really helpful in breaking it down. Drug companies spent millions and millions of dollars to formulate a way to get fentanyl to be absorbed through the skin. They spent a lot of money creating fentanyl patches, and that is an effective way. So the myth that if you touch something that contained fentanyl on it, because of how small fentanyl is, that it would be absorbed through your skin is just not very correct. There's a lot of fear that we want to kind of dispel. Folks that would want to be concerned about that would be law enforcement agencies or paramedics who are responding to a large drug bust, not to an individual who's potentially overdosing. When we start looking at the state of California, I'm sorry, this is United States. When we start looking at data in the United States, we can see that typically what we're concerned about when we talk about opioids is heroin. But when we look at the overdose death rates in the United States, what we really want to be thinking about are these synthetic opioids, and it's relatively new. This is a glance at the state of California. Again, this is fentanyl-related overdose deaths. We really started to see that spike. It's starting in 2016, increasing in 2018. 2020 is when COVID hit, and that's where things have escalated. In the year 2021, we had 121,000 emergency visits related to opioid overdoses. In the state of California, we had almost 7,000 people die from overdose deaths, and 84% of those were from fentanyl. So this is new in our realm. When we look at Nevada County, again, out of 18 overdose deaths of any type of overdose, 0 in 2019 were from fentanyl. In 2020, 19 of those 37 deaths involved fentanyl, and by 2021, 17 involved fentanyl out of a 44 total. These are people, these are our community members, these are individuals with pets and families, and it's more than a number. And hopefully this is enough to really alarm us into the fact that we need to be watching out for each other and ourselves. We see this dramatic increase as the fentanyl gets into our drug supply. The state, the nation is seeing this increase. It's not just here in this community. But there are signs of hope. We did see a decrease locally here in Nevada County. As far as Placer County goes, again, same type of thing. We saw a little bit more in 2019, but we're seeing this growth. So we're taking a harm reduction approach, and I think you guys heard Caitlin say harm reduction approach. We know that we need a practical set of strategies and ideas aimed at reducing the negative consequences of any types of behavior associated with drug use. We need a different approach from zero tolerance and from the war on drugs. Caitlin went over how it is developmentally appropriate for young adults, for teens, for tweens to start resisting authority, pushing the boundaries, and experimenting. We can always say that abstinence is always an option, but let's also talk about how we can keep kids safe if they are going to be experimenting. I was a slide behind, sorry. So some of those harm reduction approaches are seatbelts. Condoms are another harm reduction approach when it comes to safer sex and unwanted pregnancies. Sunblock is a harm reduction approach. And so the ones that we're going to talk about for the opioid crisis are safer techniques if using and experimenting with drugs, managed use if you are a recreational drug user, being aware of your settings and your support, and knowing that abstinence from drug use is always an option. The key principles here is the harm reduction approach. Let's try to make this as safe as possible. We want people to have autonomy. We want to think about the socio-cultural factors, and we want to really be realistic about what's possible here. One of the harm reduction techniques is Narcan, or naloxone. Naloxone comes in a lot of forms. The form that you're going to see the most in this community is Narcan nasal spray. And you might have picked up a box out there. We also have these kits, which are more for public-facing organizations or anytime that we could have more representation. But in that is a little case, or two of these cases of Narcan, and we're going to talk more about that here shortly. You might also find Narcan in a syringe format or in like an EpiPen type of format. There's also ones where you can screw on a little nose piece onto a vial. So for overdose, there are some risk factors to take into consideration. For a person that might be experimenting or using multiple substances, this really increases their risk of opioid overdose. The purity and the potency of the substance that they're using, as well as an individual's tolerance level. And another thing to consider is the supply. Where was this product manufactured? Where was it brought in from? Who has had it? And how did you get it? And then there's situation-related overdose risks, like for a person who is potentially using a substance alone. If they're using alone, no one is going to be there to recognize when they start to overdose. A person's physical as well as mental health can be a risk, as well as the physical environment in which they are using. The signs of a potential overdose include being unresponsive to touch or sound. If you go to shake someone and they're not responding. If they have slow, irregular, or their breathing has stopped completely. Cold, pale, clammy skin, a slow heartbeat, low blood pressure, dizziness or confusion. If the tips of their fingers or their lips start to turn blue. If they're really having a hard time staying awake, or pinpoint pupils. These are all signs of a potential overdose. Now, a person could be really high. It doesn't necessarily mean you need to give them Narcan. What we need to do is we need to determine, are they overdosing? An overdosing person is unresponsive. They're not just relaxed, they're not responding. They might have a really deep snoring or gurgling. They call this like a death rattle. They're really struggling to get any air into their lungs. They might not be breathing at all. They could have an irregular heartbeat or pulse. Again, that cold, clammy skin. Their lips are blue. It's more than just the slow reaction, the slow words. That's somebody who's really high. Somebody who's potentially overdosing cannot be woken up after doing like a sternal rub on them or the verbal stimulation. They might have a heavy nod or be completely non-responsive. So there's something called an opioid nod. And if you can nod your head like this, it's way different than that. It's something where your entire body seems to be doing that nodding motion, or they might be bent over just kind of at a 90-degree angle. These are all signs of a potential overdose where Narcan would be beneficial to use. During that overdose, that toxic amount of the drug or the combination of the drugs that is overwhelming the key bodily functions is starting to interact with our receptors, and it's slowing down the breathing. That is the #1 cause of death from an opioid overdose. Our organs, including our brain and our heart, are not getting enough oxygen, and they're beginning to shut down. It leads to unconsciousness, brain injury, and eventually death. Within 3 to 5 minutes without oxygen, that is when brain damage starts to occur. And with an opioid overdose, surviving or dying really depends on breathing. The process is rarely instantaneous. Typically, there's time to see this person going from being really high to overdosing. It can take minutes, but it can take up to hours, depending on when the drug was used and what their system can tolerate. More often than not, there is time to intervene between the overdose and the death. So if there is a possible overdose, we want to give Narcan. We want to tell the person, hey, friend, you're overdosing and I'm giving you Narcan. You want to call 911. You want to do your best to keep that person awake and breathing. You can lay them on their side to prevent choking or drowning, and you want to stay with them until emergency services arrive. Narcan nasal spray is the opioid antagonist, or you could also do an intramuscular injection. It rapidly reverses the overdose, but it might take more than one dose. So there are multiple kits. There's multiple doses in one kit. It's legal to have and carry at any age, and youth 12 and older can obtain Narcan without parent permission. It is not a controlled substance. It cannot get someone high. It can be used with anyone with a potential overdose, a potential opioid overdose. There's no known side effects. The most that the box describes is getting diarrhea or a bloody nose. We want to make sure that we don't freeze or expose Narcan to excessive heat. In California, there is a statewide standing order that allows individuals and institutions to have Narcan. So it's completely legal to add it to your first aid kit. And we have protection through the Good Samaritan law. It works by blocking the opioid receptors. It's knocking the opioid off and replacing it. It can take effect pretty quickly, and it'll stay in effect for about 30 to 90 minutes once it's working, which means that we can't just give Narcan. We also need to get them connected to healthcare. In excess, the opioids or the contamination excess drugs can lead to that fatal overdose. So when the person wakes up, they might be going through a withdrawal. We need to think about this person who is in such a euphoric state that they were completely out, and we are shocking them back into reality. They might be confused or scared. They could be upset, shaking, nauseous. They could be violently sick. When I talk to EMTs and law enforcement who have given Narcan, they'll talk about how angry and aggressive people could be. Not everyone. Sometimes, they're just violently ill or just confused, but it's potential to give the Narcan, to get them into the recovery position, and to get away to a safe distance. But our role is really, really important. We're there as a first aider, and we can give them encouragement. We can let them know, hey, friend, I've called 911. Help is on the way. You're safe. And that Good Samaritan law is really what we want people to know about. If someone is potentially overdosing, the law is going to protect us from and them to make sure that we get them to care. It's not just for opioids. It's the same when it comes to any type of mental health or health issue. You can only have personal amounts of drugs or drug paraphernalia on you, in which case you will not be arrested or charged. It is California's AB 472, and it's going to provide protection from arrest and charge if you're seeking medical attention at the scene of a suspected drug overdose. You can't be obstructing medical or law enforcement personnel, and your efforts have to remain compliant. Let's see. There's probably a lot of questions about this. Kim, do you want to chime in? Oh, we got a 5-minute. We'll speed things up. So this law is really intended to help people feel safer in a crisis. It does not apply if someone is on probation or if there's other illegal activities that are happening at the scene, like firearms, drug production, kids that are in danger, any of that kind of stuff. So to keep it high level, remember, if you are alone, give Narcan before calling 911 and put 911 on your speakerphone. If you're with someone else who's available, have them call 911. Don't leave that person alone after giving Narcan. It will wear off in 30 to 90 minutes, and a longer lasting opioid could outlast the Narcan. Don't call a Lyft or a cab and then send that person home. Remember, it's safe to use no matter what the medical issue is, and it's safe to use on anyone. You can use it on kids of any age. You can use it on pregnant people. There's even stories of dogs who have gotten a hold of substances like a fentanyl patch from the trash and overdosed. It can revive animals. When someone wakes up, they might be upset. Try to be as supportive and calm as you can. One of our questions was about fentanyl testing strips. This is what they look like. I have them up here, and we'll be able to hand those out with instructions. It's a testing strip that's kind of the opposite of a COVID or a pregnancy test. If you take the substance that's either a powder or a pill, you're going to have to liquidize it, and I can do more information on how exactly to use the fentanyl testing strips, but we have really comprehensive instructions. You get it into a liquid format, and then you put the testing strip in. If it comes up with one line, that means, whoa, hold on there, stop. This contains fentanyl, do not go any further. If it comes up with 2 lines, it means kind of that politician 2 thumbs up, let's pause here. This specific piece, this sample did not contain fentanyl. Is this something you still want to take? Do you have Narcan, and are you using with another person? So that is how the fentanyl testing strip works. They are available to use on anything that can be made into liquid, and we can liquefy pretty much anything. If someone's going to try something that they don't know where it came from, we really encourage them to test it first. For somebody who's young and not using recreationally, they're just experimenting, this might be something that they'd be willing to do. For somebody who's more of a recreational drug user, it's something that they might not necessarily find value in. However, with the current state, when we looked at all those graphs, this is something that's really important for us to do. Again, same information. If fentanyl is present, someone can rethink using. This is the harm reduction strategy. Thinking about that chocolate chip. I've tested a small part of it. Am I certain that the rest of the batch is ready? Do I have Narcan? Do I have my buddy or someplace to call? So Narcan, fentanyl testing strips, information. We have all of these things available for you here tonight. I wanted to share the No Overdose campaign because like any other community in this country right now, Nevada County, Placer County, we're seeing a rise in our deaths. We see fentanyl entering our supplies. The goals of this campaign are to prevent death from overdose, to keep people safer when using drugs, and to connect people who are using drugs and their support networks to resources. There's a lot of organizations who are starting to sign on to this campaign. If you represent an organization, a business, a healthcare provider, a coalition, let me know. We'd love to have you join. I'm going to briefly go into some resources. We have a lot of resources in this community. So this is a link to get to this big old list. Tahoe Forest is here tonight. They give away free Narcan and fentanyl testing strips. If you go to the emergency department and ask for it, you can get training in English and Spanish from Sam. You can call, you can text. The No Overdose campaign, talked about just briefly, but there's a lot of really good information at that website. There is treatment and support from behavioral health within Nevada County. There is treatment at Tahoe Forest with medication-assisted treatment, the Bridge program, and there's also a substance use navigator if you want to talk with anyone, if you want to talk to someone about any type of substance use. At our website, at thespeedyfoundation.org/Truckee, you can get all kinds of information and how to request trainings or events to have us tabling or to obtain any of the resources here. Gateway Mountain Center, they do distribute Narcan and fentanyl testing strips, but they are working on a harm reduction video project with students. They're looking for individuals to display kindness to people in vulnerable situations. They are looking for people, whether they use drugs or not use drugs. They're looking for people that treat others with dignity and respect. They're going to be creating videos to help combat some of the stigma associated with substance use. They're looking for teens and young adults. They're going to be learning professional camera work and editing techniques. They can tell a story. They can help save a life. They can contact Greg. And then on April 22nd, there is a medication take-back day. This is another harm reduction strategy in our community where we can help get some of these medications out of your homes so that they aren't being used as they were not intended. So we'll be out there with the police from 10 to 2 at the Safeway parking lot. And with that, again, we've got a training evaluation. I will ask Kim to send a link to that out because I love feedback. I'd love to hear thoughts, where this information would be useful, who could use Narcan and fentanyl testing strips, who would benefit from a training, and maybe who are some of the trusted messengers within our community that we can really get trained up and become some of our champions. And again, our next night is not tomorrow night. Our next parent night is going to be on April 19th. So I do have resources for businesses if they're interested. We've got Narcan, we've got posters, I have fentanyl testing strips, and I will head to the back after our Q&A is over to talk with you guys individually. What kind of questions do you have? Yeah. Marijuana, other drugs, anything. I have a family friend who lost her son who was an adult, he was 29, to contaminated mushrooms. It can be in anything. We want to be testing anything you're not getting from the pharmacy. You just had another question. Vaping. It has been found in vapes. We have not found it in vapes here locally. I had a training with the police department back in November, and that was one of my slides that said, do you know of any vape that has contained fentanyl? And they said, no, we've never heard of that. But we are seeing it in some of the larger urban areas. San Diego was one of the cities that when I was researching it came up. We are not seeing it here. And if we do find it here, we need to know about it immediately because that means we're going to have a pretty big issue on our hands. Yeah. We are not finding it in products from dispensaries. We are seeing it, the fentanyl poisoning that we're seeing is either coming from prescription misuse, meaning think about somebody who maybe has been prescribed fentanyl patches for cancer pain, and maybe they don't have this great support system. Maybe they're misusing that unintentionally. Then there is the black market fentanyl that we are finding. Yeah. Yes. Either they're intentionally putting fentanyl, grains of sand-sized fentanyl onto mushrooms or marijuana or other drugs, or the drugs are coming in contact with fentanyl. Like if we think about that rock of fentanyl that we saw in the police photo, if somebody were carrying that and then they had other drugs, like let's say they had a baggie of cocaine and they aren't necessarily being super sanitary about things, those two could become contaminated. So there's intentional counterfeit drugs where somebody is getting a pill press and they're getting filler and they're getting fentanyl and they're making a counterfeit pill, or there's contaminated drugs. In Truckee, we're not seeing much of the contaminated drugs. We're seeing the counterfeit drugs, where people of all ages are obtaining drugs like Xanax, Percocet, pills that look like prescription drugs, but they were not made in a pharmacy. They were made in a lab or in someone's garage using a pill press. Until 2019, you were able to buy a pill press on eBay and Amazon. So it's really easy to get a hold of. They've been confiscated at the border, but that's really where we're seeing the issues of counterfeit fentanyl here in this area. It's a great question. Yeah. Right. Yes. Is fentanyl death overdose going to start to decrease? We hope so. In our Nevada County data that we saw, we saw that it came down, at least for deaths. We're not seeing that nationwide. And unfortunately, because this is an industry where drug dealers can make a lot more money selling counterfeit or contaminated substances without any type of investment, we're probably not going to until we find a way to really combat this, until we get really smart about what we're putting into our bodies. And everyone understands that this can happen to anyone at any time. We all have to take precautions. Yeah. Mm-hmm. Right, yeah. Yeah. Right. Mm-hmm. So it's a great question, and I don't think I necessarily have a great answer for you. Research will be conducted. Research is being conducted when it comes to Narcan and people's interest and excitement, I guess, in taking risky behaviors. But at the same time, right now, based on where we're at in those numbers, we have to take radical action. When we did this training with the police department, that was another big pushback from them, where it was like we're somehow giving them permission to start experimenting. And that's not how we want to present this. We want to present to young people that abstinence from substance use is always an option. And if you are going to experiment, if you're going to engage in this activity, we want you to know the risks so that you can make this decision on your own. We want you to understand that this is riskier than it has ever been in the history of our society. And if it's something that you're willing to risk, there are a couple things that could help you if you get into trouble. We want you to be aware of those. We're going to encourage you not to do it. But if you're going to, we need you to stay safe. We didn't do well with the war on drugs in this country. We have not done well with a zero tolerance policy on anything. And so we have to take a new approach. It doesn't mean that we throw condoms out into audiences and say, let's get wild. We're not going to do the same thing with harm reduction supplies. But we do know that not only teens, but families, there's a lot of recreational drug use that's happening in this community. So my concern isn't only for the students and their drug use, it's for the parents. It's for their older siblings who are coming in and out of the homes. It's not necessarily their drug use that I would be concerned about. I would want them, and I've talked with several young people in this community who need these harm reduction supplies to help take care of their family members. Yeah. Yeah. Yeah, they don't test powders. We have to liquefy the powder. So we can take something, get it into a powdery substance. So with something like mushrooms, it's going to be much harder to get that into a liquid. But if you can get it mushed up and test it as a liquid, you'll be able to see if there was fentanyl in that sample, and then you can still take the sample and use it if that's your intention. Yes, yeah. Yes, cocaine. Yes, very prevalent in cocaine. There's a lot of people who don't know about this. There's a lot of people who don't know that opioids, or that fentanyl is an opioid, and what the difference is between an opioid and marijuana. There's a lot of ignorance when it comes to substances and how they work and what's happening. It's not, some people are lacing things with fentanyl because they want to get higher, because they've got a really high tolerance level. But a lot of people, and the concern that we have as a community is the people who are doing things unsuspectedly. And so the reason would be to get people high, to feel an effect on something that wasn't as potent. Like you could take some really crappy cocaine and you could lace it with fentanyl, and all of a sudden it's a lot more fun. But that person who did that cocaine didn't have any idea that they were taking something that had fentanyl in it. That's a good question. Yeah. Okay. Great question. Just a second. Kim, will you open your email and hit the link that I sent you? How prevalent is...
Absolutely.
How prevalent is opioid use in our schools? We measure teen drug use from a survey that they take. Kim could be able to speak to the results of that a little bit more, but what we'll say is that teens who are self-reporting drug use, it goes underreported. So we know that it's happening, and we know that some students are really concerned that the reporting is so low that it's more prevalent than the adults know about. Yeah. But Kim, do you have anything to add to that on what we know about the prevalence of opioids in this school district? Yes, yeah. Placer County has a campaign called One Pill Can Kill. It's a national campaign, and I asked Kim to open this. Kim, do you want to scroll up just a little bit? I wanted to talk to you guys because and I know that it's past 7:30, so if you need to get up and leave, you're not going to hurt my feelings. You're not going to interrupt me. Keep going. We're looking for some emojis. So here we go. You guys have kids, and they have smartphones, and they have social media. And so the way that they are talking about this is through emojis. This might be what a text message, a Snapchat would say, and what they're talking about is a Xanny bar. They might be talking about getting a Percocet pill. A counterfeit Percocet pill looks exactly like a prescription Percocet pill. So students who are trying to get things like an anti-anxiety medication to help with some of that stress that they feel, because maybe they've been vaping and they want something more, or maybe they think vaping is a bad idea, but they still feel that anxiety, and they used to have a prescription, but their counselor took them off of it, and now they just want to get some help, some relief. And so their friend on Snapchat said, "I've got Percocet. Great, I'll take it." But it wasn't a real Percocet pill. It was a counterfeit pill that had fentanyl in it. And those are the deaths that we started to see through the pandemic, locally and across this nation. You can scroll up just a little bit more if you don't mind. This, there's just a lot that we might not be aware of. This is what, this might be drug dealing advertising here, but kids have their own language. They're very creative. So we can be aware of what they're doing as best we can, but the most important thing we can do is create a solid relationship. That's the best thing that we can do. We can have conversations, we can have trust, we can share that right now what's happening with drugs is really scary. And if this is something that they or their friends are engaging with, we need to talk about it. We need to talk about it for reals. If we take this whole approach that kids are just not doing drugs, that people are not doing drugs, we're going to experience a lot of loss. If we take a different approach and say, let's reduce as much harm as we possibly can, you don't have to engage in substance use. And in fact, more teens these days are abstaining. The problem is that the ones who are engaging are risking a lot. They're risking a lot more than we ever did. Any other questions? JD. So drug overdose, I'm so sorry. I've personally been touched by loss. I'm so sorry. There are grief resources. Drug overdose, deaths, suicide losses, and alcoholic deaths are all these complex grieving pieces. These are called deaths of despair. And there are resources specific for people that are going through that. I would imagine that most of us in this room have been touched in some way by the opioid crisis, and my heart goes out to you. I think we just need to start talking more, and especially reaching out when we know that somebody's been impacted by the opioid crisis. Make it a casserole disease, the same way you would talk to someone who announced a diagnosis of cancer or a loss due to cancer. We need to support individuals who have had a loss due to a death of despair. I will be back by the resources along with Tahoe Forest and Kim Bradley with the school district. We can have more conversation. We can answer further questions. Thanks for staying here late. And please, let's continue to do more of this. We're happy to set additional events up, and we will have another parent night on April 19th.
Thank you, Shannon. I just want to let you know that this is being recorded, and we're going to put it on our website. for those that weren't able to make it. So to get the word out that we want to get this as to many people, educators, parents as possible. We are also going to be bringing this to our high schools. So we will be doing presentations at Truckee High and at North Tahoe High as well. North Tahoe High will be in April and Truckee High will be in May. And so we really want to educate our students about this and to get the word out. So we really appreciate you being here, and we're here to answer questions. Or if you wrote your email down, we can also send you more information and a copy of the recording if you'd like that. Thank you.